I mentioned a while ago that there was a conflict between Clarke and Van Til about the contents of God's mind versus the concepts in God's mind as opposed to the concepts in man's mind, the thoughts of God versus the thoughts of man. In Clarke's view, God's thought is unlike man's in two ways. First, quantitatively, that is to say, God knows a lot more things than we do. He knows a lot more facts than we do. Secondly, in mode, God's thought is an eternal intuition, whereas our thought is a temporal progression. We gradually accumulate more and more facts, more and more knowledge, while God knows it all together, all immediately, eternally. But, says Clarke, God's thought may be equivalent to man's in content. When God thinks of a rose and a man thinks of a rose, the same thing is in the two minds, or the same concept is in the two minds. Otherwise, says Clarke, we are lost in skepticism, for we never attain to any really true ideas, which are those in God's mind. Clarke also has a distinctive analysis of what faith is. Traditionally, in Reformed theology, faith has three elements: notitia, assensus, and fiducia. Notitia is knowledge, assensus is belief in what we know, and fiducia is trust. Now, the idea is that knowledge is just an awareness. Belief or assensus is commitment to that truth that we're aware of, and fiducia is trust on the basis of that knowledge. Now, Clarke prefers to define faith entirely as assent, intellectual assent. And he, again, this is in connection with his view that knowledge is propositional. To know anything is to assent to a proposition with the intellect, okay? And so he thinks that's the way we know, as opposed to sense experience, as opposed to emotion, as opposed to any number of other prospective ways of knowing. So Clarke is very much an intellectualist, very much a rationalist, if you want to say that, although for Clarke, reason is defined by Scripture, so it's probably best to call Clarke by the name that he most prefers, and that's to call him a scripturalist. Well, generally I think that Clarke is a very powerful thinker, a powerful apologist, and I think his arguments against empiricism are generally right. Now, there's an ambiguity here. I would agree with Clarke that you can't know anything through mere sensation, but I think you can know through perception. Sensation versus perception. Those are two different things. Sensation is just the raw data that come to my retina and my eardrums and my physical organs. Perception is a work of the mind that working on the sense data, interpreting the sense data, understanding them in a framework, so that we can say such things as the clock is on the wall. Now, that's an interpretation of sense data. That's not just a report of sense data. Now, I agree with Clarke that through bare sense data, you can't know anything at all. But I think that through perception, that is the brain interpreting our sense data, through perception, we come to know a great deal. And of course, intellection is a step beyond that, where we put our perceptions into a framework, into a general worldview. So I think that Clarke doesn't make as many distinctions as perhaps he ought to make in order to indicate the place of sensation. You know, in the Bible, what we have seen and heard is something very important. You know, the Apostle John, at the beginning of his first letter, stands in amazement. He says, that which we have heard, which we have seen, which we have touched, our hands have handled him, of the word of life. John is not indifferent to the senses, okay? Now, I remember when Clark was lecturing one point, somebody put up his hand, it might have been me, I don't know. Somebody put up his hand and said, well, what about 1 John 1, where they saw and they heard and they touched? And Clark, who was always kind of sardonic, he often sort of dismissed questions with a wave of his hand and a couple of well-chosen words. It was kind of formidable. You didn't like to answer back when Clark was saying something, but Clark's reply was something like this, answering a question with a question. He said, well, what did they see? What did they see? And you see what he was looking for, what he hoped that we would reply, I think, is, well, they saw colors and shapes and sounds, but they didn't see that he was the Son of God. I think certainly John did not believe that they were merely seeing miscellaneous colors and shapes and sounds. John was saying that they were not only sensing but perceiving. They saw him, they handled him, and of course they interpreted what they saw and what they handled in a framework of interpretation which came from the Old Testament and came from the teaching of Jesus himself. But I think that you don't need to be as negative about sense experience as Clark is. I could say more about Clark. I think that a lot of his arguments against non-Christian thinking are pretty good. Of course, remember, as an apologist, it's never enough to show that the non-Christian has an inconsistency, because, of course, he may think that you have an inconsistency too. I mean, he may think that the doctrine of the Trinity is inconsistent. He might think that the problem of evil is inconsistent. He might think that, so you may need to do a lot of explaining. And that is why, though, often it's not enough to show somebody that his view has a contradiction in it. I mean, what do we do as Reformed Christians when somebody points out an apparent contradiction that we can't answer? Do we just throw up our hands and say, well, I give up, you're right and I'm wrong? No, we hang on, we remember that God has an answer even though we don't. We remember that often apparent contradictions display themselves on reflection to be consistent. To point out a contradiction is never a final argument. And I don't think we can assume that our Muslim friends would take it as a final argument either, or our atheist friends. I mean, they may see something that's that they can't answer. They may see an apparent contradiction in their thought that they can't come up with a complete answer to. But they do what we do. They set it aside and hope that some later time they'll be able to come up with an answer. So the business of displaying logical contradictions is not a final apologetic argument, but I think it's often valuable. I think it's often helpful to do that in an apologetic confrontation. By the way, on the Van Til Clark controversy about the incomprehensibility of God, about whether God and man can have the same thought in common, I think that I've solved that problem. And I think I think both of them are right within a certain context. I think they misunderstood one another. but they were speaking in such partisan terms and almost political terms that neither one was able to hear what the other one was saying. And if you want an extended discussion of that, I suggest that you look at my book called Cornelius Van Til, An Analysis of His Thought. And there's a chapter in there called the Clark Controversy. And I believe that I've solved that problem. I believe that I've resolved that controversy, and so that's why I guess I'm not much interested in going over it with you at this time. But feel free to go back and look at that at your leisure.